College football nerds doing our top 10 a day late, but it's just as cool as if it was Monday. It's going to be good anyway, so y'all watch it. You're here, so you're going to watch it. Want to plug two other videos we did this week. We did a Who is Better, Mac Jones or Tua Tagovailoa at Alabama. Obviously, Tua's on to the NFL, but it's a decent discussion. We get into the nuances of old offensive schemes that Tua played in versus Sark's. And if you are nerdy about schemes and players and quick releases, go check that one out. Also, we did talk about Michigan, Ohio State. We did a model on that one, and we got into the Michigan potential coaching situation and what we need to see from Ohio State defensively. So, two plugs, go check them out. Like, subscribe, hit that bell, helps us out a ton. And in the homework this week, you know what you got to do. Give us your top 10. All right, Josh, we're going to do the same thing we've been doing for recently. I'm going to do my top 10. You're going to do your top 10, and then we're going to talk about it. Alabama, Notre Dame, Clemson, Ohio State, Texas A&M, Florida, Georgia, Cincinnati, Oklahoma, Miami. Give me yours.
My top 10 are pretty similar in a lot of ways. Alabama, Notre Dame, Clemson, Ohio State, Texas A&M, Florida, Georgia, Oklahoma, Cincinnati, Indiana.
So Alabama's kind of boring. We're not going to talk about that one too much. They're the best team in the country right now. I don't think it's much up for debate. I think there was a little, 2018 we saw, Alabama best team ever, and then they got blown out by Clemson. I felt like Clemson was up there. I don't feel that right now that any team is as complete as Alabama. The only thing I will say about them is I'm a little concerned that they still haven't played a good offense recently, and they might be hiding some warts. Those busts against LSU were pretty bad. Notre Dame at number
Let me,
two. Go ahead.
let me, if you don't mind, let me go in and throw something for Alabama before we both talk about it. I just want to give somebody an understanding of where Alabama is relative to everybody else. FEI, it's for Mo, who's kind of a friend of the channel. We follow him on Twitter, does something on bcftoys.com where he puts out the FEI ratings. Now, this was through week 14, but Alabama's offensive rating in FEI was 2.49, and that's like the average points per drive, basically. The next best team in the country was Ohio State at 1.85. Like, Alabama's scoring 33% more per drive than the next best team in college football in Ohio State. Defensively, they're slightly ahead of Ohio State, giving up less than a point per drive. And if you think net points, so every drive, offense versus defense, Alabama it comes out to about 3.66 yards per play. Okay, so that's the difference in if they run an offensive play and you run an offensive play, they're averaging about 3.7 yards per play better than you are. The only team close to them was BYU, but obviously against inferior competition. In P5, the next best was Florida at 2.3. Alabama is a 50% larger differential than anyone else in the P5. So I don't want to belabor it, but we haven't spent a ton of time talking on Alabama. But statistically, Alabama is actually like 30 to 50% better than anybody else in the country in a lot of metrics. It's a really, really significant gap, not just the eye test, but statistically.
If you have the numbers in front of you, what's the gap? So that gap between Alabama and Florida, what's the same gap? How far do you have to go down for Florida to the team with the same amount of gap?
So that was 1.3. You're making my job hard, but do you like doing that? About Florida to Tulsa, number 3 to number 26.
Because that really puts it in perspective. Like that's wild. Okay, y'all chew on that a little bit. The gap between Alabama and the next best team is the same as the number 2 team to Tulsa, who is not that bad, by the way. Notre Dame, I think they've earned their number 2, and I think we're already mentally dropping them down with a loss to Clemson that has not happened yet, so that's not fair. So they're still firmly in my number 2. I want you to talk a little bit about Clemson. You had some observations for the Virginia Tech game that I think are worth noting. It is, we're already Notre Dame haters on this channel apparently, so let's also be Clemson haters, I guess.
Yeah, Virginia Tech had a weird sloppy game against Clemson. And you look at the final score of 45-10 and you think, wow, Clemson dominated. But the truth is, they kind of didn't. Trevor Lawrence was 8.9 yards per attempt. Travis Etienne was 4.1 yards per carry. Both marks were outgained by their counterparts at Virginia Tech. Their quarterbacks ended 10.6 yards per attempt and 11.3 yards per attempt. The starting quarterback got knocked out in that game, and they ended up playing three different guys at quarterback. And then the leading rusher for Virginia Tech, Herbert, was 4.6 yards per carry on 21 carries. Just a really, really weird game. Clemson had 433 yards to Virginia Tech's 333. That was in large part because Virginia Tech fumbled the ball 3 times in that game. And there was also a lot of other stuff that went on. Like you talk about how effective Herbert was, there were a ton of sacks. Those backup quarterbacks got sacked a million times, more or less in that game. I think, and just in terms of sacks and tackles for loss, there were 14 by Clemson. Give them credit, but also just being realistic, there was a lot of stuff that Virginia Tech was doing wrong. So, given that there was a muff snap that was returned for a touchdown, and then towards the end of the game, they kind of busted coverage and left somebody one-on-one and he got beat for a touchdown. That was a 24-10 game, really late going into the fourth quarter that kind of got blown open. Virginia Tech was keeping it close. And let's be real with this. This is a Virginia Tech team that also got blown out just as badly by Pitt the prior week, 47-14. So I don't know. I'm still concerned. I see a lot of problems with Clemson. They never shut Virginia Tech down at any point, but they feasted on the fact that they were playing a team that didn't have a real quarterback in the game. Clemson still got some real holes to me, and that's the reason why Notre Dame, not just the up by default, Notre Dame is playing much more complete football right now than Clemson is, and they're kind of getting their margins, I think, a lot more honestly than Clemson's been getting in their games.
Notre Dame fans now can pick themselves up off the floor after you heard them get some praise. They heard you give them some praise. 2 counterpoints to you. 1 million sacks, more or less. I'm going with less, not more. Probably a good bit less than 1 million sacks. And look, Clemson, it's fair, I think, to say Texas A&M was rusty against LSU because they had a long layover from missing a game with COVID. I think Clemson might, we got to give them the rust excuse as well. I think it's only fair. But at some point, and which is really the point that I think that comes out of all of this, at some point with Clemson and Ohio State, we can't just live off of who we think they are. They need to show us that they are who we think they are. I've got Ohio State at number 4, and I'm right in there with them. Tell me if this is fair. A couple of weeks ago, you said, because you had Texas A&M, I think, at higher than Notre Dame, you said you were going to drop Texas A&M if they didn't absolutely annihilate LSU, and they did not. Is Ohio State in a similar boat with you in that they need to really dominate Michigan, or they're at the risk of you dropping them, or just win, baby, and move on to the next one?
It's more just win and move on, and it's easy to say it's a rivalry game. I think anyone that says that doesn't understand that A&M LSU is definitely kind of a rivalry game itself. Those schools are pretty close, and that's a pretty heated game. The difference is LSU's defense is abhorrently bad. I mean, I'm pretty sure everybody just saw that last weekend because a lot of people probably just watched them for the first time, given the way the season started for LSU. They're awful. And my point with A&M was I needed to see them consistently put it together and play a good offensive game against a defense that had a lot of issues, and they didn't do it. I think A&M redeemed themselves a lot against Auburn. I will say that. They are a more traditional team, but the biggest thing between A&M and Ohio State is conceptual in how they play offense. Ohio State is very modern. A&M is playing kind of throwback football, and they're doing it with an inconsistent quarterback. But they're built to score 20 to 35 points and maybe 35 points on a really, really, really good defense, playing old school football. They don't do a lot of the RPO spread stuff. I'm not sure if Mon could or couldn't do it, but they've kind of refused to adopt it. What I saw versus LSU was, to me, A&M just simply is playing an outdated mode of football, and I don't think it's going to translate very well if they get in the playoffs. I think Ohio State and their more modern, more RPO based football is doing the stuff everybody else is doing to exploit the rules, exploit the way you can get guys downfield, all that crap that makes teams dominant. That's why I dinged A&M so much, because if you did those things, you'd kill LSU. Ohio State versus Michigan, I already know what they are. I know how they're going to do it. And quite frankly, I think Michigan, for all their faults, is still a much better defense than what LSU is putting out this season.
Yeah, I didn't love an 11-point win over Auburn. Auburn's not a bad team as much as Big Ten fans want to say they are, because they don't want to give any SEC team credit for beating Auburn. Auburn's not a bad team, but an 11-point win in a game where you got a clear interception dropped that fell into the hands of your tight end in the end zone, that game could have gone a different way. And A&M trailed for a lot of that game. So I don't love that. At some point, again, show me something besides the Florida win. I'm waiting for it. And Florida fans have been in our ear for the last month saying, y'all, look, we're clearly better than A&M. Just move us up. And Josh, I need you to talk about this, because this is 3 weeks in a row where I'm like, you're talking about A&M's ugly wins, but come on, Florida, like, help us out. Vanderbilt 38-17. I think it was 17-10 at the half. Kentucky 34-10. Tennessee 31-19 in a situation where I think they got 2 touchdowns in the last minute of the first half. Florida did. Still 31-19. Like, that's not an impressive playoff level caliber win for a really bad football team. Are you starting to get a little concerned with Florida, both just in general with these scoring margins and the fact that they can't run the ball?
Definitely with both. And my clap back to Florida when they kept saying, oh, we got to put us at an A&M. Clearly, we're a better team. We're playing better football, et cetera, et cetera. It's mostly after the Georgia game. The first thing is A&M, like you've talked about a lot, love it or hate it, A&M statistically won that game. They were the better team across the board statistically. It wasn't a fluke. Passing, rushing, all that stuff. They were the better team, and that matters. My point was, look, Missouri has problems in pass defense. They've gotten lit up by every good passing game they've played. Georgia, I really felt like kind of hit the breaking point against Florida with Seen out. Stetson Bennett hurt his shoulder. That's forced them to finally pull JT Daniels out of retirement or whatever the heck situation he was in. Don't get me started on that one, but, well, maybe do get me started because we'll bring up Georgia. So, sure, let's go ahead and discuss that real quick. Why in the world did JT Daniels not come in relief of Bennett against Florida? But I do think Georgia is an improving offensive team. They've placed really bad teams that are really depleted. We put some tweets out, and they were, I will say, my fault. That Georgia team has only played teams now with 4 or more backups in the secondary since that game, due to COVID, due to opt-outs. I mean, guys that started the season have all dropped out, so they're playing teams that are mismatch. Florida's done the same thing, and you've got to realize the Georgia defense you played did not resemble even the Georgia defense that Alabama had played just a few weeks prior. It just didn't. They have not been a good defense since then. And 44 points was really good, but in retrospect, it wasn't shocking because we saw like Mississippi State move the ball a ton and stuff like that. Arkansas is kind of shaky on whether they're quitting. And then you get into Vandy, Kentucky, Tennessee. Look, these are not elite defenses, but they've been solid off and on. Vandy is not athletic, but they've been pretty consistent. At least you've got to out-athlete them. They're not going to give up cheap plays. And in those games, they got their 30 to 35, but not a lot more. When they haven't been given easy points, they're not just annihilating people. And defensively, they're still giving up some decent yardage and points to teams that, like Vandy and Kentucky, sure, it wasn't a ton, but those are putrid offenses. And Tennessee moved the ball some in that game. I think Florida is a really good team, and I think they've got a really good offense. But the idea that they are top 3 in the country, elite, I definitely think is premature. There's still plenty of warts on that football team, and I think most Florida fans understand that fact.
Yeah, and they'll have their chance. If they want to make the playoffs, they're going to be able to lose a game to A&M and still get in. They still control their destiny. Just beat Alabama. And that's saying a lot. But look, if they didn't have the Texas A&M, they could just play close to Alabama and still get in. So they got a little bit more work to do. I've got Georgia at number 7. I think it's fair. I don't love the defense situation because, like you said, it hasn't been great since they sustained the injuries, and they really haven't gotten back on track. Games like the Mississippi State game concern me a little bit. I hate that the Vanderbilt game got canceled. I know Georgia AD had some chirping about that, and I think he had a very good point. I got Cincinnati after, and you can talk about this a little bit. We talked in the Ohio State video about how Ohio State's firmly in, and this is the year that everybody's clamoring for a G5 team, and this is y'all's other homework. Let me know this, because you can't just say put a G5 team in. You got to say who you're going to put them in at the expense of. In this case right now, in terms of seeding, it'd be Ohio State. I want you to tell me, loaded gun to your head, are you taking Cincinnati on a neutral field against Ohio State? You're not. I'm not taking them. If Ohio State's laying 13 points, I'm still taking them. So do that. Let us know in the comments what do you think about that. Josh, do you feel the same way, and kind of talk about this back middle of the pack of your top 10?
I do. And we've been on this for weeks and weeks, right? That you got to be really careful, much more so this year than any other year, in evaluating these non-P5 schools because there's very little overlap. And you can blame the P5, you cannot blame the P5. It doesn't really matter from my perspective. It's just trying to determine how good teams are. And I think there were enough reasons for things to turn out the way they did. I took some admitted heat in the middle of the BYU Coastal Carolina game because I felt like BYU was dominating Coastal Carolina at the line of scrimmage. And we're going to kind of address all the G5s here at once. I'm going to start with a negative because I feel like shooting myself in the foot. But there were two things that I was really trying to get across. One, I'll say our model was actually pretty accurate. If you looked at the yardage totals and everything, it said, BYU is going to outgain Coastal Carolina by like 20% and lose the game anyway. And that's more or less what you got. You got a game where BYU outgained Coastal Carolina. BYU, and the other thing I said was I felt like Coastal Carolina was getting thrown around like it was a cupcake SEC game, which everybody laughed at when Coastal Carolina ended up winning. BYU ran for 8.2 yards per carry in that game. They won the game because BYU was really inconsistent in the passing game in particular, where they gave up way too many negative plays. But that's what your problem you've got with a lot of these G5s. They're not tested. I mean, BYU, and the reason I'm bringing this up, they had just won by 40 to 50 points dating all the way back to like September. Really, the Houston game was the last time they hit a remotely close one. That was a 3-touchdown win. And the game before that was the Texas-San Antonio game that people kept laughing at us and saying you got to throw that out. Well, they just put up 17 in a game. So it's not so silly to say, yeah, a lot of these G5 teams are unmotivated. You get teams like Boise that I kept harping on the fact that BYU was in game 8, Boise was in game 4 when they played. And, after 3 games, you're just not in the same place as somebody that's played 7 or 8 games. It's difficult to evaluate. And I think Cincinnati, I think Coastal Carolina, of those, I had BYU the top because I thought they'd been the most physical and dominant and the most equivalent to a lot of P5 teams. I'm okay putting Cincinnati in there kind of by default. But I didn't think Coastal Carolina has the size to play with a real P5 team. I haven't seen Cincinnati's offense be anywhere near consistent enough to play against a real defense. And the reality was twofold for me in BYU. I saw a BYU team that wasn't athletic enough, got exploited on the edges. And the other reality was BYU had some plays to like Powell, the receiver, and he's a 6 foot, 200-pound guy, and he was running people over for Coastal Carolina. And that's the problem, right? You're going to face guys that are as big as him or as fast as anyone in Coastal Carolina in the same package. And you're going to face a lot of them on these Oklahoma teams, these Georgia teams, these Florida teams, the teams we're actually comparing you against right now. I think any of these G5 teams are a real stretch to have in this group. I don't mind Cincy because of how good the defense has been. And again, when I said the net points per play, Alabama was really, really high up there. But Cincinnati, they're the only one that's sort of in striking distance in the G5 outside BYU. And defensively, they are absolutely top. They were third actually in that defensive rating. So I think they're the only one that really has a real argument. The rest of them, I think when push comes to shove, a lot of these G5 teams, when they play real P5 teams, and it's going to happen in the bowls, they're going to get really, really exposed, and we're going to realize a lot of this competition was actually even worse than we realized, because they're going to be more affected by COVID, and they're going to be more affected by the lack of motivation.
Yeah, and like you, I don't mind Cincinnati up there. I have them at number 8. I think they're an actual good team. It's not just a participation trophy. The problem for me with a lot of these G5s is you want to be ranked by being compared against other G5s. But that's not fair to a Miami who has to play Clemson, who has to play an ACC schedule. You want to be ranked and considered for the playoffs because you've gone undefeated against a schedule that a lot of middle of the pack SEC teams would go undefeated against. And people laugh at that, but I guarantee you right now Auburn would be undefeated with Cincinnati or a BYU schedule. They would. Now, Cincinnati has done a better job lately of being dominant, so I don't have a problem with them there. I've got Oklahoma at 9 and Miami at 10. Miami was tough for me because I didn't love the Virginia Tech game, 25-24, because Virginia Tech's not a great football team. I did like, even though Duke is bad, I really liked 48-0. I like that a lot. I think Duke is just not a good football team this year, but Miami did what I wanted to see them do at some point, and that was be dominant. Oklahoma is number 9, and they're going to complain about Georgia being all the way at number 7 ahead of them. But look, your losses are to Iowa State and Kansas State, and theirs are to Florida and Alabama. So I think that we forget sometimes. We just look at win-loss records, and we forget either recency bias when a team gets some momentum, that they lost to teams that you would also lose to. So it's a tough argument. It's the same thing with A&M. Like everybody wants to say A&M, has a loss to Alabama. Everybody would have a loss to Alabama. Round out your top 10 for me and any other thoughts you have on top 10 this week.
Yeah, so I had Oklahoma 8, Cincinnati 9, Indiana 10, and I've already touched on Cincinnati and the G5 thing. Oklahoma, again, behind Georgia. To your point, we try to base this on the general idea of if you swap schedules, how would you do having swapped schedules? We talked about pre-show where Oklahoma would be, and we were talking about who would put 10th, and you're like, yeah, but I definitely pick Oklahoma to beat X team. The problem for Oklahoma isn't who I think they beat right now. The problem for Oklahoma is you lost to 2 not particularly good teams. That's it. That Kansas State loss is bad, okay? And I'm going to ding you if you're really good, and I think Oklahoma could play with a lot of teams in front of them. I think on the right day, they could absolutely play with Florida. They really could. But Florida would not have lost those 2 games. Would not have happened. And that does matter. And we are not tied to win-loss, but we're not tied to win-loss in that we consider who you played and how you played in those games. We are tied to win-loss when you played bad teams and lost anyway. And that's where Oklahoma is. Their quality level way exceeds their variability level, so to speak. It's just way too volatile of a football team. And that's why they are where they are, because I think they're as good as some teams in front of them, perhaps on any given day. But I can't possibly rank them any higher, given who they lost to and the fact that both those lost to G5 teams themselves. And then Indiana is the last one on my list. Look, Indiana lost their quarterback. I'm not going to penalize them yet for losing their quarterback, though I will say the defense did kind of curl into a ball against Wisconsin. I also think Wisconsin's a really good team. I think beating Wisconsin is a feather in its cap that a lot of teams don't have. And I think the defense is really, really, really good. And I don't think they get enough credit for the defensive play, the way they've been able to consistently hold point at the line of scrimmage in every game they've played so far this season. Maybe argue even the Ohio State game really was all passing game, and that was just OSU doing the thing elite teams do and putting up 40 plus. I think Indiana would play with a lot of other teams. And my closing thought on this before I flip it back to you is the thing we always say in the comments. All right, you don't like our top 10. Tell us who you think should be above them, right? Like, don't tell me Indiana shouldn't be a top 10 team. Don't tell me this, that, or the other. Justify why you think a bunch of other teams should be ahead of them, because there aren't really 10 great teams this year in college football. And the point I've been making, which has been taken from the other content, sort of the other side, I've talked a lot like Auburn. Like, how close is Auburn to this 10 group? I don't think I'd rank them in my top 25, but Auburn versus Miami versus Indiana, I'd probably pick Indiana, might pick Miami, but you get to like number 11 or like USC or something like that, and I don't know that Auburn doesn't beat a lot of those USC, Iowa. Heck, we've got
Coastal Carolina. Would anybody in the comments pick Coastal Carolina heads up against Auburn? No points either way. Not a single person, if their life depended on it, would pick Coastal Carolina. Not one.
I think a lot of people actually would, but I watched that game with BYU and they're dead wrong. But the flip side to that argument, I'm going to leave with something controversial. I think Auburn is not appreciably worse than BYU based off what I saw in Coastal Carolina. And I'm going to put my microphone down and step away before everybody throws some flame.
I don't think they are either. I think that Auburn is a flawed team, and that's why they can get bombed by Alabama. But, Auburn would maybe get 3 points right now against Miami, and that's a top 10 team. And that underscores your point. Like, we don't have Auburn in our top 10, probably not in our top 25, because they're not a good team. It just shows how big of a bundle of mess you have from 9 to 30. In that, I literally think if Auburn played Miami or Indiana tomorrow, they'd be getting a field goal. And that's just wild to me. I mean, if you and so when people criticize our top 10, they think of it, they're comparing it to a normal year. They're not comparing it, and they're not doing the exercise that you talked about in that, look, okay, you think Miami should be number 10, or you think Coastal should be number 10. Who do you think they're better than that we have in there? That's the challenge. This one's gone super long, and it's because it's so much fun, and I'm glad if y'all have hung on this long. We say this every week on Twitter when we post it. This is our favorite segment we do every week because it lets us talk about the landscape of college football. Maybe we should do a Dagnum live show. Let us know in the comments if you think we should do a live show. All right, y'all. Thanks so much. Have a great week. God bless.